I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the light. I'd been hiking through a remote patch of desert in Arizona, chasing whispers of a forgotten mining settlement tucked somewhere near the canyons outside Benson. It wasn't on any official maps anymore, just something I'd read about in an old message board post from a local historian. I'd been walking for hours under a blazing sun, and by the time it started to dip behind the cliffs, I was thinking about turning back. But then I reached the crest of a hill and saw it, a sagging town nestled in a basin below, barely visible through the dust and fading light. The men wore dark coats and old-style button-ups. The women were in faded dresses and lace bonnets. There were even children scattered throughout. Their clothing looked like something from the late 1800s, dusty, aged, but intact. His eyes were wide and glassy, staring just over the heads of the congregation. I stood in the center aisle, no more than 10 feet from him, and called out softly, "Hello?" I heard the faint creak of a wooden joint, then another. Heads began to tilt. Fingers flexed. One woman in the front row turned her head ever so slightly in my direction. Her eyes were still closed, but her mouth parted just enough to reveal darkened teeth. I backed away, my breath coming faster. I didn't scream, didn't cry out. I just ran toward the side of the church, throwing myself against the wooden paneling. Something gave way, whether it was a hidden door, rotted wood, or blind luck, I don't know. I spilled out into the dirt and rolled down the slope into the street, cutting my arms and knees as I scrambled to my feet. My voice cracked under the weight of the silence. Nothing. Not a flinch, not a twitch. The whole town was as lifeless as it had looked from the hill. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw until now, and I've never been able to find that trail again. Not on foot, not on maps, not even on satellite images. It's like the whole place only appears when it wants to. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And I wonder if that church is waiting for me to come back so I can finally take my seat. Not by any one person in the room, but by all of them together. Like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something wrong. Not a single person moved as I stepped into the room. I expected heads to turn, eyes to follow me, someone to flinch, but nothing. It was like walking into a wax museum, only there was a warmth to the room, a heat that rose from the candles and seemed to pulse from the bodies around me. The buildings looked half-rotted, skeletal and broken, their frames leaning at strange angles. The air smelled thick, a strange blend of melted wax, dry flowers, and something harder to name, something sour and faintly organic. As I passed the pews, I tried to study their faces without looking directly for too long. In its place was a wall of wood, seamless, unbroken, as if the entrance had never existed. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize it, to tell myself I was just disoriented. But I knew where I had to come in. I turned back to the pews. The air had changed. It was hotter now. The flames flickered more violently, their glow throwing sharper, more menacing shadows. The figures hadn't moved, but something about them was different. Their skin seemed tighter, their postures stiffer. The faint smiles on some of their faces had stretched just a little too wide. Their skin was pale, almost gray in the low light. Their mouths were closed, eyes half-lidded or entirely shut, but none looked peaceful. They weren't asleep. They were still, unnaturally so. Most looked long abandoned, Roofs caved in and porches collapsed. But in the center of it all stood one structure that hadn't completely given up, a small white church. And from its windows came something that stopped me in my tracks, the unmistakable glow of candlelight. It wasn't the flicker of a flashlight or the cold shine of LED bulbs. It was warm and slow, golden, like dozens of flames dancing just out of sight. That glow should have felt inviting, but standing there on the edge of town with dusk settling in around me, it made my stomach twist. There were no roads leading in, no tire tracks, no footprints. And yet something or someone had lit those candles. Against my better judgment, I descended into the basin, boots crunching over gravel and dead grass. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, no rustling animals. Just the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you don't see anyone. As I passed by the buildings, I noticed how wrong everything felt. The air seemed heavier, and the structures, though clearly decaying, had a strange stillness to them, like they were waiting for something. When I reached the church, the door was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see the source of the light. Dozens of candles arranged along the altar and lining the walls. Their flames flickered gently, casting elongated shadows across the pews. But it was what sat in those pews that froze me in place. People. Dozens of them. They were seated upright, all facing forward, their backs straight and hands folded neatly in their laps. I moved slowly down the center aisle, the creaking floorboards beneath me, the only sound in the room. At the front of the church stood the preacher. He was frozen mid-sermon, both hands resting on the pulpit, mouth slightly open. I turned to leave, my heart beginning to pound, but the doorway I had walked through was no longer there. Then the preacher moved, just a little. One hand rose slowly from the pulpit. It wasn't a gesture, it was more like a signal. The moment I looked back, the church was dark. The candles were gone. The windows were empty. But sometimes when I'm walking alone at night or flipping through photos I've had taken on my hikes, I catch a glimpse of candlelight in the distance. It started with a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. My friend Kyle and I were heading home from a weekend camping trip in Nevada, cutting across the desert on a back road that barely qualified as paved. It was supposed to be a shortcut, some scenic route we found online that would shave 30 minutes off the drive. That shortcut turned into a dusty nightmare. No service, no other cars, and eventually the unmistakable jolt and hiss of our back tire blowing out. We pulled over onto the shoulder, which was really just loose gravel and brush, and got out to assess the damage. No spare. Just a rusted jack and some tools that wouldn't help. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon, the sky bleeding orange over endless sand and rock. Like they were actors in a play they'd performed 1,000 times. The same phrases, the same intonations, like someone had told them how to act human, but forgot the details. And the smiles never faded. Not once. We were miles from anything, or so we thought, until Kyle pointed out a faint shape in the distance. We were given a key, just one, and led to a room on the second floor. We left the room before sunrise, grabbing our bags and hurrying back toward the highway. The tire was still flat, but now a brand new spare sat beside it on the gravel, like it had been delivered. But the moment we stepped out of the motel, everything had changed. The town was gone, completely. No buildings, no people, just a wide empty basin of dirt and stone. No signs of fire, no rubble, nothing. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of voices. Not talking, chanting. Their mouths moved in eerie harmony, and their eyes, every single one, were pointed straight at our window. A slow, rhythmic hum, like a prayer being repeated by dozens of people in unison. I peeked out the window. Inside, it was simple. 2 twin beds, a single lamp, No TV. I tried again to check my phone. Still no signal. Kyle tried to laugh it off, said the town was probably just off the grid, some weird rural time capsule with spotty reception. But I wasn't convinced. I hadn't seen a single electrical wire, cell tower, or even a car in this town. Everything was too still, too quiet. Barely visible through the heat shimmer was what looked like a town, a small one, maybe a dozen buildings, clustered together in the valley below. There was no sign pointing to it, and it hadn't shown up on the GPS earlier. But we didn't have many options. Leaving the car locked, we grabbed our water and headed toward it on foot. The town was strange from the start. Not abandoned, everything looked maintained, in a way but old. The buildings were straight out of the 1940s, gas station with glass pumps, a diner with a hand-painted sign, even a small movie theater with a lettered marquee that read "Welcome Friends." When we finally got service again, I searched for hours looking for ghost towns in that part of Nevada. For any history of a place like what we'd seen, nothing. No records, no mentions, not even old maps with matching geography. As we walked down the main street, we started to see people. Not many, maybe 10 or 12 at first. All of them were dressed in outdated clothes, plaid shirts, long dresses, suspenders. They stopped what they were doing to wave at us, wide smiles plastered across their faces. One woman walked right up to us and said, "You must be tired from your journey. You'll stay the night." Of course. It wasn't a question. Kyle and I looked at each other, uneasy. I tried to pull out my phone to check our location, maybe call for help, but there was no signal. Not even one bar. Just the word nitrogen monoxide service staring back at me. We asked if there was a mechanic in town or someone with a phone we could use. Everyone responded the same way, smiling, nodding in sync, and repeating some version of "No phones here, but we'll take good care of you. Just rest." They offered us food at the diner, a room at the motel, water from a pitcher that tasted faintly sweet. Something was off. The people, they talked like they were reading from a script. Not robotic exactly, but too rehearsed. The motel was a 2-story building with faded green paint and dusty windows. We locked the door that night, pushed a chair under the knob just in case. Down in the street, every resident of the town stood in a perfect circle. Each held a candle. I shut the curtain. Neither of us slept after that. We ran back to where we'd left the car, and there it was, sitting right where we parked it, untouched. We didn't speak much during the drive home. But here's the part that keeps me up at night. 2 days later, Kyle sent me a photo. It had been slipped under his apartment. We were 3 friends trying to build a name for ourselves on YouTube by filming abandoned places, old schools, forgotten factories, broken down houses with rumors attached to them. Our channel hadn't taken off yet, but we had a decent subscriber count, and were always looking for new material that might push us over the edge. Ghost towns had become our newest obsession. They had the perfect blend of isolation, atmosphere, and decay that audiences loved. That's how we found ourselves out in the deserts of eastern Utah, following a rough hand-drawn map from a guy we met in a local forum. But as we made our way through the town, we couldn't help but feel a little on edge. The buildings were in worse shape up close. Doors hung half open, some rooms had collapsed roofs, and windows were shattered inward like something had escaped. There were no signs of wildlife. No birds, no insects, not even a stray coyote or lizard, just dust and stillness. We filmed as much as we could inside the general store, the broken-down saloon, the old jail with rusted iron bars that bent inward like something large had pushed against them. The air changed, the faint hum stopped, and something down there moved. It wasn't a rock falling or an echo. It was a sound like breathing wet and deliberate, followed by a soft scraping noise, as if something was adjusting its position at the bottom of the pit. Nick leaned in closer, said something like "hello," and then suddenly dropped his phone. And the next morning, when we returned with help, there was nothing there. In it, Nick is standing alone behind the church, staring down into that circular pit. And if you zoom in just behind him, you can see 3 shadowy figures rising up from the edge, bent, spindly, and reaching. We still don't know what we found out there or why that man warned us, but we've never gone back, and we never will. No town, no buildings, just flat desert, like we'd imagined the whole thing. No structures, no foundations, just dust and open land, not even footprints. We waited for the sound of it hitting bottom, but it never came. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. The footage was perfect. What we saw first were fingers long, jointed too many times, black and dry like burned driftwood, sliding up the edge of the hole. There were more than 10 of them, maybe more than 20. No eyes, no face, just limbs pulling. But all throughout, the church loomed at the far end of town, standing alone at the edge of the basin, separated from the rest by a crooked fence that was half collapsed. I didn't look back until we were almost to the van. When I did, the church was still standing, still silent. Nothing followed us, but Nick wasn't with us anymore. He claimed he'd found a town that wasn't on any real map, a place locals avoided, a settlement left behind after the mines dried up. The church looked more intact than anything else, but it was clearly weathered paint, flaking off in sheets, the steeple leaning slightly, and no sign of a bell. The front doors were shut, chained together with a rusted padlock, and the windows were too dust-caked to see through. It should have been a cinematic ending to our shoot, but all of us hesitated. The man's warning hung in the air, still unanswered. That kind of setup practically begged to be filmed. He vaulted the broken fence before we could say anything and headed around the back. We called after him, but he didn't respond. He was too focused on getting that perfect thumbnail. Eventually, we followed, less because we wanted to, and more because leaving him alone back there felt worse than whatever we were worried about. After hours of driving through dust and heat, our GPS eventually cut out, leaving us to rely on landmarks and guesswork. About 10 feet wide, carved clean into the ground, was a perfect hole. It wasn't natural. The edge was smooth, almost polished, and the interior walls weren't dirt or stone, but something that looked like black tile or obsidian. It went down farther than our flashlights could reach, and the air around it felt thick and wrong, warmer than the rest of the desert, humming faintly with a sound you couldn't quite hear but could feel vibrating in your chest. Nick knelt near the edge, phone flashlight aimed down, and whispered, "It's man-made. Look at the walls. Someone built this." Just as we were starting to think the whole thing was a bust, we crested a ridge and saw it below us. A small town, maybe a dozen or so buildings, all half sunk into the cracked desert basin like they were being swallowed by the land itself. There was no road leading in, no welcome sign, just a collection of buildings that had no business still standing. We parked the van just outside the town and started unloading our gear drones, tripods, batteries eager to film everything before sunset. As we were setting up, a man approached us, seemingly out of nowhere. We never heard his footsteps or saw where he came from. One moment we were alone, the next he was standing just outside our camp. He looked to be in his 60s, tall and weathered, with a long dark coat that didn't make any sense in that kind of heat. His face was sun-wrinkled, and his eyes were a sharp, piercing blue that didn't seem to match the rest of him. He didn't ask what we were doing or who we were. All he said was, "You boys can film whatever you like, just don't go past the church." His voice was calm, but there was something final about the way he said it. Like it wasn't a request, it was a warning. We asked him why, but he didn't elaborate. He only repeated it once, slower this time, locking eyes with each of us before walking back toward the ridge and disappearing over it without another word. We joked about it at first. It felt like something out of a horror movie, an ominous warning from a desert stranger before the bad stuff begins. By the time the sun was lowering, casting long shadows across the dirt, we finally made our way toward it. Nick, our usual frontman, the guy who always pushed the envelope for views, laughed it off and said this was exactly what the channel needed. Behind the church, the land dropped off suddenly into a shallow ravine, but what drew our attention wasn't the terrain, it was the circle. We stood behind him, staring into the darkness. None of us could explain what we were seeing. Then came a shift, subtle but unmistakable. That's when something rose from the darkness. It wasn't a body. It wasn't even a shape, exactly. We ran without speaking, stumbling through the brush and leaping the fence like it was nothing. We waited for hours, engine running, watching that dead town grow darker by the second. He never came back. The only thing we had left was a single screenshot from the drone, just one frame that had been uploaded automatically to the cloud before the signal was lost.